It's 1786, and a male ballet dahn-sir and a ballerina are both dancers at the Paris Opera House. The man falls in love with the woman, as frequently happens, but so does a soldier. And in the love triangle, the dahn-sir is killed. With his dying breath, he asks that he be buried in the opera house to be near his love in death, if not in life, and his bones are later used as props in theater productions. Could this story be the inspiration for the Phantom of the Opera? Or in 1873, the original opera house burned down just as the new majestic Palais Garnier is being finished, leaving the ballerina dead and her fiancé disfigured. The disfigured fiancé moves into the new opera house. Could this story be the inspiration for the Phantom of the Opera? Well, ironically, the Phantom of the Opera isn't a phantom at all. He's a real guy. He's not a ghost. He's flesh and blood. So it might not be that surprising that there's a whole bunch of mysteries surrounding the Phantom of the Opera, but very few of them have to do with ghosts or specters or ephemeral things. They're real facts and figures that you could know, but there are so many questions. What and who inspired the characters? Was there a real chandelier accident? And if so, what happened? This story has obviously gained some traction, but when the book was published, was it a flop or was it a hit? And this question has actually consumed most of the contemporary debate. How did Carl Laemmle, the CEO of Universal Pictures, even find out about the book? What makes this narrative so enduring that it's inspired a book, a movie, and a musical, and not just one musical and not just one movie? What makes the musical so popular, maybe even more popular than any other entertainment production, including the movie, including the book, including any movie? And is it the same thing that made the book work? Is the hook that is making Phantom the musical the same hook that was making Phantom the book work? Or is it the case that the narrative of the book makes the musical work? Or is it true that the musical resuscitated a poorly written book? Was Andrew Lloyd Webber a fan of the book, or did he consider it a penny dreadful? How does the story end? You'd think there's a simple answer to that question, but it turns out there are multiple endings and multiple incantations. And as interpretations fly around, an intrepid independent scholar, a guy named Raj Shah, finds a previously undisclosed, undiscovered original manuscript that shows what the author was thinking at the time the book was printed. What did that manuscript reveal, and which of these questions did it answer? And finally, the big question, where are the ghosts? It's the Phantom of the Opera. There's a cool old opera house. Surely there's some good ghost stories surrounding that. I hope we can get to the answer to that question. Anyway, in this series, we are going to take a 3-part dive into the Phantom of the Opera. First of all, we're going to look at the book, then we're going to look at the movie, and finally, we are going to look at the musical. I'm John Brushke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production and go into a deep dive on the questions that it raises and the answers that it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life. And I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. All right, we're ready to get rolling, but there are some events we need to talk about that happen before the book is even published. We will get to the book, we will get to the author, we'll get to the reasons for its success, but just to set the stage, here are 5 things that might have preceded the book, that definitely precede the book, that might be important to know. The first thing to know is that there is an old opera house and then there's a new opera house. We'll talk extensively about the construction of the new opera house, but we start about 100 years before that's built. Episode number 1 is the tragic death of the dahn-sir Boismaison, and that is Boismaison. I will just apologize now for my butchering of the French language and the French accents. I'm going to take all these words and put them in the show notes so that you can see how these things are spelled. I'm just going to try to pronounce it close enough that if you care about the spelling and the pronunciation is important, then you can go look it up in the show notes and figure that out. Okay, this comes from Raj Shah, the independent scholar. He studied at Cambridge. He'll feature prominently in a bunch of our later mysteries. He found this story, and it's been repeated by Olivia Hoffman. Hoffman was writing for the French Country Home. What separates Olivia Hoffman's treatment from that of Raj Shah or anybody else is at the end of it, she includes this admonition, quote, "If you'd like to have a little piece of the night of the Paris Opera in your home, check out these candles and soap on the MFCH Boutique." I mean, you just can't end a tale about the Phantom of the Opera with anything better than a pitch for some candles. Anyway, here's the way the story runs. In 1831, the Paris Opera, this is the old Paris Opera, runs a production called Robert di Diable by an author named Meyerbeer. It's a hit, and it has, quote, supernatural sensationalism. So Meyerbeer translates Karl Weber's Les Freischütz into something that works for the massive French opera production, and that's going to run in 1841. He had the big hit in 1831, a decade passes, and now he's going to translate a German language production and make it into something that can kill it at the French opera for a second time. But just as the production is commencing, a tragedy strikes, and it's reported in French, German, and British papers with strikingly similar language. It goes like this, and I will say the original language is strikingly similar. What I'm about to read you is a translation that I got with the assistance of my son, who had 2 years of high school French, the Google Translator, which I then took and freely altered for intelligibility, but I will be reading it to try to capture some of its tabloid favors. So this is my bastardization and recreation of the original text that appeared almost verbatim in a whole bunch of different magazines. It goes like this. I'm going to try to read it to capture the tabloid flavor. In the second act of Freischütz, during the scene of infernal invocation, a skeleton moves on stage, and this appearance produces a certain sensation to the public. The skeleton is real! Exclamation point. In 1786, a young man of 18, one of the supernumerary pupils of the dance school at the opera, named Boy-Masson, became in love with Mademoiselle Nanine Dorival, a student like him, and daughter of the usherette of the Count of Artois' lodge. But her beauty was such that a Mr. Monsieur, a sergeant major who commanded a post with 60 French guards, also got the attention of this young lady. Boy-Masson saw his misfortune, and he took revenge. One evening, he waited for the French guards to pass and resolutely went to take his lucky rival by the throat. The soldiers subdued him, and Mauzier had the young man put in stocks overnight and left outside the opera to suffer his public shame. He was rescued the next morning, but he found no sympathy within the opera. The theater folk laughed at his expense. Boy-Masson developed a fever, went to bed, and realized he might never recover. So he dictated a will. He bequeathed his body to a Mr. Lameron, a doctor attached to the opera, who had a practice in the hotel itself. The poor young man begged Mr. Lameron to keep his skeleton in the cabinet to be, even after his death, close to his loved one. His wishes were granted, and his skeleton has not ceased to be part of the material of the establishment, and theater life began for him again. All right. The jilted dancer is killed by the evil sergeant at arms who's patrolling the Paris Opera House, but he asks that his bones be retained and kept for the opera. That wish is granted, and his bones are used in future production. This tale was committed to the memoirs of the opera house director, a guy named Roqueplan, 14 years later, again using the same strikingly similar phrasing. So this story is in wide circulation. Starting in 1841, it gets codified by the director of the opera about 14 years later, and that puts us into about 1865. So about 100 years after that is when we start looking at the original text of the Phantom of the Opera, the original conception. And the question is, how will this story play into that? All right, our second episode also happens at the old opera house, where there is a fire and maybe even death. Olivia Hoffman is a journalist, and she was writing that in 1873, there was a fire at the original opera house. And as the Palais Garnier is being built, a ballerina died, and her fiancé, a pianist, becomes disfigured. He returns to the opera house, where he lives out the rest of his life. Gillian Rosso, also a journalist, cites the exact same story, giving the name of the original opera house. No sources are cited, but this is a contending story for the inspiration of the novel. This and the just prior one. Okay, we now are moving into the new opera house. I haven't yet told you how that's going to be built, but in our third episode that precedes the novel involves the following of the chandelier. So this is at the new opera house. All right. There are a number of different accounts of this. They're all by journalists. And I believe by the end of this, my theme is going to be cite your damn sources. That just to take a brief academic interlude, if something happened and you weren't there to witness it, but you're giving a direct quote or a direct account of it, obviously you weren't there. You didn't see it. You've you're getting your information from somewhere. And what careful researcher would do, be you a journalist, be you a scholar, be you an internet sleuth, you got to put down where you found your information from. That way other people can look it up. So that if it turns out the original source is incorrect, you can say, oh, well, that was, my mistake for using that, but ultimately not my bad because the original source was untrue. Or if somebody sees conflicting accounts and they want to get to the bottom of it, they would look up the original sources, compare them to each other, figure out which one is probably right. But none of that can happen if the sources are not cited. And I want to say, if there's one big mystery to me with the Phantom of the Opera, it is why does nobody cite their sources? All right, here we go. The chandelier accident. Olivia Hoffman, who is ready for My French Country Home, the tome where you can get the Phantom of the Opera soap, writes that a counterweight, not the chandelier, but a counterweight that held it up, fell into the crowd and, quote, one person was killed. Angelica Fry, a journalist and writer for a publication called C Muse, wrote that the counterweight fell and it killed, quote, a concierge named Madame Chaumette. All right, so it's a person, but now we know who it is and what her job was. Jillian Russo, another journalist writing for the New York Theater Guide Journal, wrote that on May 20th, 1896, so we have an exact date, the counterweight fell and killed, quote, one person and injured many more. And the Curiosity Damsel website wrote that in 1896, a counterweight fell and killed a man. So what we can say with certainty was that there was a person who was either male or female and may or may not have been a concierge was killed when a counterweight fell on or about May 20th of 1896. That does appear to be a real event, but we will be unable to identify with more precision what exactly happened because none of these four journalists and the Curiosity Damsel have cited their sources on this. But we will get to somebody who has, and that's going to be our hero for this episode. All right. The fourth incident that is happening. So now we have two tragedies. We have two stories floating around. As those stories are floating around and we've moved into the new opera house, a counterweight falls and there's death. Here's episode number 4. This doesn't happen in the opera house, but is after the new opera house has been built. And it is the fire at the festival. In 1897, so about a year after the chandelier incident, a charity event was being held in a large wooden structure that was covered with a canvas. It had booths with projectors and music. About 1,500 to 1,800 people were present, but it's 1897, so projector technology is not yet great. And the projector is powered by ether. And I should also mention, of those 1,500 to 1,800 people present, there were a lot of aristocrats. So it's just before the 1900s. It's the late 19th century. The aristocracy is still thriving. And there are some very powerful people that have some very impressive titles, including a duchess who is the sister of the Empress of Austria. At the time, there weren't so much celebrities as much as there were royalty. And wherever the royalty went, that was the big event. So that's what made it an important event. All right. So they have their ether powered projector. The projector went out, and as it was being relit, someone struck a match, which lit the ether. A column of fire shot out, and the entire structure caught fire. Chaos ensued. There were throngs rushing towards the exit. Those who escaped were wailing for help down the streets. The fire burned for 2 days. And when it finally died down, there were more than 126 people who were dead, almost all of them women. The men of Paris were called out for the stampede, that when this chaos ensued and lives were at stake, instead of helping others that they might be expected to assist, instead the men of Paris just stampeded towards the doors. The structure collapsed, and about 120, 130 people died. Almost all but 5 or 6 of them were women. So what this event does sort of show is there's some insight and a very into what happens in a disaster. If something like, say, the Titanic were to sink or a chandelier were to fall from the ceiling, how would the people involved react? And I think this was a very prominent incident that anyone paying attention to would have gained some information from. Okay, we are now up to our 5th episode before the Phantom of the Opera gets written, and it is the building of the Palais Garnier. The Palais Garnier was built between 1861 to 1875. The guy who built it was named Garnier. That is how it got its name. The production was halted by a war, and the Second Commune, so the original French Revolution, is about 100 years earlier. There's an original Parisian Commune. There's a second Parisian Commune that actually occupies this structure just as it's getting finished. And about the Commune is 1871. Construction on the building started in 1861 and ended in 1875. So the Commune of 1871 is about 4 years before it's finished, but about a decade after they've started working on it. This structure is the perfect setting for a Gothic novel. And I'm just going to read a direct quote from Peter Haining. He's a British journalist with some theater chops. He's definitely cuddled up with Andrew Lloyd Webber. I'm going to quote it at some length because figuring out what's up with this structure is kind of central to the rest of understanding what's going on in this book. Quote, the site of the opera covers 2 3/4 acres, and while the massive footings were being excavated, a deep bed of water was discovered. This threw the initial plans into confusion and necessitated the driving of huge piles below the water level. Before this could be carried out, the water had to be drained, and 8 steam pumps were said to have worked day and night for 8 months to achieve this. Sentence ends with an exclamation mark. A flooring and walls of bitumen were laid, and the water was allowed to return to form an eerie subterranean lake. The lake, as the reader will discover, plays a significant part in the story of the Phantom. The cavernous lower half of the building was required to facilitate the raising and lowering of giant sets to and from the stage. Some of these can be as high as 50 feet and weigh as much as 22 million pounds. This, though, was only one element of Garnier's amazing building, although it remains to this day the least known area, and access to it can only be obtained by special permission of the director. The next paragraph, every single sentence ends with an exclamation mark, so I'm going to give you the true emotional feeling of that. Here we go. When finished, the opera contains no less than 17 floors, a vast maze of stairways and corridors, lifts, ladders, and chutes, all interconnected yet so complex that it was easy for any unwary person to get lost. As if this is not enough, there are at least 2,500 doors! Exclamation mark. For the performers, Garnier built some 80 dressing rooms with anterooms and wardrobe closets for the leading artists, and 8 other huge dressing rooms which could accommodate the 20 to 200 members of the chorus and orchestra! Exclamation mark. For the Emperor Napoleon, he also constructed a whole private section complete with salons, cloakrooms, and guardrooms, with below one of these a permanent stable able to accommodate over 100 people, 6 coaches, and as many as 50 horses! Exclamation mark. In another equally huge section, Garnier made provisions for the storage of every possible kind of prop that might be required for a production, from a hatbox to a virtually life-size sailing galleon! Exclamation mark. I am making a big deal out of this just because I remember my upper division writing instructor told me you should never end a sentence with an exclamation mark if it's exciting enough that'll come out anyway. Anyway, that is not what our friend Peter Haining has selected to do, but whatever his sins are involving punctuation, he's definitely given a very good impression of this thing. It is huge. It's enormous. There's a lot going on in the 16 lower floors beneath the actual stage itself, and nobody really knows what's going on. It's kind of dark. There's a lot of secret entrances and exits that you kind of have to know where you're going to get there, and this is what the Paris Opera House is like. Haining also adds that this includes in the lobby a painting of dancing girls by Degas, which are part of both the book and the movie. They feature very prominently in it. All right. Here are a couple of questions that have come up about the Paris Opera House, the Palais Garnier. There's a question about dead bodies and the placement of a phonograph archive. Now, everyone agrees that there were some recordings made of the great singers of the day that were put on phonographs that were put in a time capsule to be placed in the catacombs around 1907. So it's been around for a while. They're going to take these and put them in an archive. And some people maintain that the bodies were found. Leroux, the author of the book, it's actually in his introduction, where he claims that while the phonographs were being placed, both bodies of prisoners from the Paris Commune were found, and there was another body, which is that of the Phantom, which the introduction said was real, and there's an epilogue that says he was wearing a ring, which proves that it was real. We'll get to that later. But I will say, as I have read through the commentary on this production, the consensus is that the phonographs were real and prisoner bodies might be there, but the phantom body is definitely not. Angelica Fry, our journalist friend, said that there were dead bodies there, but they were from the 1871 commune while the opera house was being constructed. They used it as a prison, and there were some prisoners that were left there. So definitely phonographs. Probably not a body who is definitely an historically actual phantom, but maybe some dead bodies. I mean, so now we've got this incredible palatial, perfect Gothic setting for a horror story, and probably dead bodies are in those 16 floors of catacombs underneath. Now, at the bottom, there is, in fact, a lake. But what is this lake and what does it look like? Well, according to Olivia Hoffman, our journalist friend, there's an underground reservoir that, quote, aided in the house's exceptional acoustics and that firefighters used to practice it. Olivia, of course, cites no source. I am not sure how a lake 17 floors below the stage can actually help any acoustics anywhere. I don't know a ton, but, you know, in my vast experience as a garage rock band keyboardist, I can't imagine anything 17 floors away would make any difference, but Hoffman says that it does. Olivia Fry, also a journalist, says the lake is an arm of the Seine, that the water is in cisterns and the inhabitants are catfish, which is very specific, but for which she cites no source, and that's definitely not what Olivia Hoffman had to say. Jillian Russo, also a journalist, said there is a lake. There once were fish. Firefighters do practice there, and there's a legend that someone once lived there. Jillian Russo also cites no sources, but they're just journalists. Peter Haining, he's our theater expert. He's the guy who wrote the introduction to the book that came out in 2002. Peter Haining writes, they found a, quote, deep bed of water. They boiled it out with 8 steam pumps running 8 months. They laid the foundation, the footing, and then let it come back, quote, to form an eerie subterranean lake. We've encountered this before, but Peter Haining also cites no source. Okay. So there is some water. It is somewhere beneath the opera house. It is either in cisterns, might or might not have fish. Firefighters might or might not swim in it. Probably not if it's stored in cisterns. But what is definitely the case is not a lot of people have been down there to see it. And what appears to have happened is that as the stories have circulated, journalists refer to whatever story it is they've heard without citing the source that they got it from. But there's definitely some kind of water down there. Okay, so we are now at the end of our 5 events. The building goes up about 14 years before the novel is published. As it is going up 2 years before it goes live, the extant opera house had burned down, potentially disfiguring people. But by all accounts, it's a terrific setting for a Gothic horror tale. It's got grandeur. It's got catacombs and mazes and secret doors and compartments. It's got dead bodies. And the other thing that happens is, boy, there are a lot of scholarly critics who wish to psychoanalyze the story. And almost every time they do, they make mention of the opera house. The opera house is one of the things that it is so central to the story that the psychoanalytic critics we will get to have a lot of very, very abstract things to say about it, but they locate the opera house as kind of central to what makes them think what they do about the story. So as a quick recap, the opera house is up and running by late 1875. It has inherited stories from the old opera house dating back at least a century, and including a love triangle with a disfigurement, 2 fires, and a falling chandelier. Plus, there are other ghost stories floating around that many of the journalists talked to, although none of them were named specifically enough that I felt I can include them here. All right. So those 5 events are floating around, and into this walks Gaston Leroux. He is the author of The Phantom of the Opera, and here is his story. He was raised to fairly wealthy parents. They were merchants. He was raised in a boarding school, and he was studying to be a lawyer when his parents passed away. And at the age of 20, he inherited a huge pile of money. It was $1 million. I've seen the word dollars or francs or whatever the currency of the day was, but it's probably enough that he could, if he wanted to, just live a life of leisure for the rest of his time. Instead, in under a year, he blew it all, mostly on gambling and booze and whatever other miscreant behaviors one could do with a lot of money just before the turn of the 1900s in Paris. But he definitely lost it. All the money, that is. So now he needs to get a job, and he decides he's going to become a journalist, that he had been studying to be a lawyer. He's got some linguistic skills. He had a couple poems that had been printed, so he had some literary aspiration, but he decides he's going to become a journalist. And in that role, he thrives. This story is told by Peter Haining. This comes out of the foreword that he wrote for a 1993 publication of the book that was done by Barnes & Noble. Listen to what he has to say. I think this gives a very good flavor for the kind of guy that Gaston Leroux was. The straightforward reporting of cases soon began to bore Leroux, and in 1892, he decided upon the bold course of trying to resolve a case before the verdict was reached. He was convinced that the accused man was innocent, and the reason he was being kept under such tight scrutiny before his court appearance in the town of Bourges was to protect some incompetent officials. How he managed to see the man, to learn the truth of the matter, and in so doing set up his own career as a writer, he later explained in an interview with Frederick Lefevre in April 1925. I note in passing, he is now citing a source, but he's saying a guy and an interview, but he doesn't say where you can find that interview or what publication it is. So it's not possible to look up this interview unless you do your own original research. But here is the interview. Quote, I managed to get hold of a sheet of official paper and wrote on it that I was a M. Arnaud, I think that's Monsieur Arnaud, an anthropologist charged with visiting local prisons, he said. This I presented to the director of the prison, and he allowed me free access. I had no trouble finding the man I wanted to see, and he was only too delighted to tell me what really occurred. I got my paper to publish a full report, which completely exonerated the prisoner, and as a result, the prefect of police was disgraced, and the prison director was sent packing. Curiously, it was my newspaper colleagues who were the most annoyed. I had interviewed an accused man in prison before his trial. It was something that had never been heard of before in the law reporting, he added. And then, despite what other journalists may have thought, the story made Gaston Leroux's reputation, and in the subsequent years, he went on to establish his name with exclusive interviews with a number of distinguished public figures. He tried to repeat this by meeting the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Chamberlain. He got as far as the office, but Chamberlain wasn't there, so he instead wrote a story about how he almost got to meet Chamberlain. That was published. He also did some important reporting on the Russian Revolution that in 1905, as that was happening in the early part of the 1900s. And he also covered theater and was a theater critic. So that's his life as a journalist. In 1907, he quits journalism. And the tale that is going around is that he quit it when he came back from his travel. And then his boss told him, hey, you have to immediately get on the next bus, train, boat to go to travel abroad again. And he just decided he was done with it and quit on the spot. Whatever the truth is, he was definitely traveling around the world. He was definitely an accomplished journalist and definitely stopped doing it around 1907. So in 1907, he's no longer a journalist, but he still needs to support himself. So he wrote 2 novels, including one called The Yellow Room, which is, if not the original locked room mystery, one of the earliest and best examples of that genre. He was trying to do something that Edgar Allan Poe had written, or that Sherlock Holmes series might fit in well with. But it was successful. It is still critically regarded, and you can look at people who are interested in the horror mystery novel, and they can point to that book as an important one. He also wrote another title that was called The Perfume of the Lady in Black. So he's got 2 books that have been published. He's not written great literature or something that's massively successful, but he is something like John Grisham, right? He has tapped into some cultural artifact that does seem important, and he's found an audience for it, and he's making some money on the book. And then he would go on to invent 2 series, including a detective named Rouletabille, Rouletabille. That is French, I can't say, and Charlie Bibi. So he has a couple of serials that are going. They're not they're not as prominent as Sherlock Holmes, obviously. They're not as well known, but he's a accomplished enough author that he can make a living just by writing books. All right, but he gets his first 2 books underneath his belt. And then in 1909 and 1910, The Phantom of the Opera appears initially as a serial in newspapers. It's Les Gaulois, Goulois, over a course of 2 different years. Interestingly, at least 2 Phantom of the Opera experts, or people who claim that an area of expertise they have is the Phantom of the Opera, have incorrectly asserted that it did not appear as a serial, but it definitely did. It was a series of short stories that got published in serial fashion, kind of just like Sherlock Holmes. Then it is eventually compiled into a book. On March 26th of 1910, a revised version of those stories are published as a novel. It's called The Phantom of the Opera. And thank you, Raj Shah, who we are going to talk about extensively. He's the guy who put an exact date on the publication of the book. Okay, so now this book is in print. What's the plot? What is this book about? Okay, I am going to try to provide a short enough summary that it does not consume 3 hours of this podcast, but also includes enough detail. And I'll just say at the front, I'm leaving some stuff out. I'm going to focus on the things that will become important in our later episodes, but I do hope this will at least give you a flavor of what's going on. Okay, so you open the book. There is an introduction where a narrator claims the ghost is real, and by that he means it's a human being. It's not a spirit. It's not a ghost. It is a real live human being, and then also asserts that the action that it's about to follow is correct. The action begins. There is a ball for the outgoing theater managers, and as that is happening, some young dancers find a dead stagehand, and they attribute it to a ghost. It is said to be a suicide, but there's no rope. That same night, an aspiring opera singer named Christine Daae, I think that's it, D-A-A-E with an accent over the E, our leading lady, replaces the established soprano Carlotta. Carlotta has fallen ill. Christine sings. Christine kills it. And Raoul, an aristocrat holding the title of Viscount, I believe it's how you say it, is her childhood friend. He hears her sing. He falls in love with her over again. He heads to her dressing room to say that he's in love with her. Christine says she has already promised to marry another, but doesn't really say who. The romance continues through letters and meetings on travel where Christine spurns him and eventually reveals that her suitor is a voice that she hears in her mirror and says she believes it's the, quote, angel of music that her father told her about. They have a fight and the outlook for the romance is bleak. But one night, Raoul follows Christine to her father's tomb in a graveyard where Christine reveals that her father told her about an angel of music that might reawaken her musical talent and turn her into a prodigy. And she thinks the voice that she's hearing in her dressing room is that voice. He's the one that's been helping her learn how to sing. But Raoul sees there's a third person following both he and Christine. He pursues him. He rips off the mask, sees the horrifying face, and bravely faints. We cut away from that. We go back to the retiring theater managers warn the incoming group about the ghost. The incoming theater managers dismiss it, but they soon find that there is a ghost who makes his own demands. The Phantom demands that Christine be able to perform the lead role in Faust, which is held by Carlotta, and also that they should leave box 5 empty. Doesn't say why, but apparently that's where the Phantom is going to watch the opera from. The managers refuse the demands, and the Phantom makes good on his threats. Carlotta's voice cracks as she's performing it. A chandelier falls from the ceiling, drops into the audience, and kills a concierge. Christine disappears and days pass. But then Raoul gets a note from Christine telling him to meet her at a masquerade ball that's coming up. Raoul confronts Christine about the man in the mask. They fight, they reconcile, and as they work out their high school dating drama, Christine runs to the dressing room. Raoul eavesdrops. He hears that she's talking to someone named Eric, and then she disappears behind the mirror. Things kind of go back to normal, and the drama between the two potential lovers is resolved, and they agree to marry. They meet on a rooftop, and Christine reveals the whole story, what's been going on. She went behind the mirror and she was taken to the Phantom's lair beneath the opera via a secret lake. And he played her music that he had written and he sang with her. They both had great voices. She was told not to take his mask off, but she did, to discover that he was a human and not an angel. Unlike Raoul, she didn't faint, but it's still a big rupture to their relationship. She concluded that the Phantom Eric was mad, but she was moved by his music. He was furious with her, Eric was, but he let her go while giving her a ring and making her promise to return to visit him. Christine and Raoul then plan to elope, but Eric is eavesdropping on their conversation. Turnabout is fair play, Raoul. You eavesdropped on the Phantom. He's eavesdropping on you, and the Phantom is not going to let it slide that they will elope. Christine has promised to come back and visit him. That night, Christine is abducted in the middle of her performance. Raoul approaches the police, who dismiss him except for the Persian, who knows Eric and his backstory, and agrees to help Raoul vanquish the Phantom. The Persian is a mysterious international police officer who's been tracking Eric for decades. The Persian leads Raoul to the lair, but doggone it, they fall into a torture chamber, and they find magic tricks, mirrors, and a rope that they conclude was used to kill the stagehand in Chapter 1. They overhear the Phantom telling Christine that she must marry him or die. She says, "No, I love Raoul. Go ahead and kill me. I'll take that part of the deal." But then the Phantom says, I will blow up the entire opera with a stash of gunpowder that I've been keeping for just such an occasion as this. She agrees to marry the Phantom to spare the opera and asks him if he will spare Raoul and the Persian. The Phantom takes the deal and will not blow up the opera. You come get married to me. Eric then removes his mask, revealing his hideous appearance. Christine kisses him on the forehead. They both cry bittersweet tears. He cries because nobody's ever touched him this way, and she cries out of pity, fear, and loss. Realizing that he can't force her to be with him against her will, Eric agrees to release her to Raoul with the promise that she will return the ring to the Phantom's body after he dies. Eric then dies of love sickness and confesses to the Persian all the crimes that he did, and clears up a few that he didn't commit, and his life passes from his body. In an epilogue, we learn much more about the Phantom's backstory. The narrator of the introduction then claims that he has found the skeleton in the catacombs wearing the ring, which is proof of the Phantom's real existence. The narrator laments that, had he not been so deformed and ugly, the Phantom's gifts would have made him a celebrated musician. Here's the quote. He had a heart that could have held the empire of the world, and in the end, he had to content himself with living in the cellar. That is our story, or at least my paraphrase of it. It is a tragedy that ends in the deaths of a lot of non-player characters and the death of the anti-hero. It's a story that will start here in 1910 and will go on for more than 100 years and spark a bunch of other reproductions. All right. What are the mysteries surrounding the book? I wish that these were great spooky mysteries, but they sort of have a lot to do with just academics beating each other over the head with large books, but they're interesting nonetheless, or at least I find them fascinating. So here are the mysteries. And let me just say, Raj Shah here is the hero. I mentioned that he is an independent scholar. That means that he's not affiliated with any university. He doesn't have a job in an English department or a theater department or a communication department. He's not publishing to get tenure. He did some advanced university study, but he is not currently an employed academic, but has sunk his teeth into this question. And as much as I have harped on other people not citing their sources, this is the guy who has gone back to the original source material. He's published a couple of different things. We're going to talk about one of them right now. In 2004, there was a manuscript given by the estate of Gaston Leroux to the National Archives. It was a preliminary manuscript, so this is not the text of the final book that was published in 2010. It more closely resembles the serials that were produced in the newspaper, but it does give some insight, a lot of insight actually, into what Leroux was thinking at the time that he published the book. And this is the draft, so it's got both what he had originally written and all of his edits, so a bunch of stuff that got crossed out, some things that were added in later. Shaw got a hold of this. He read it and he published about it in 2013. And then in 2016, he also went back to review how popular the book was. In 2020, he wrote an article about how the book compares to the musical. We'll get to that. But right now, we're just going to focus on this 2013 paper that he wrote that talks about what is it that manuscript that was discovered in 2004 reveals about the Phantom of the Opera. Mystery number one, was the book well received? Now, Andrew Lloyd Webber in later years has definitely said it was not. And Peter Haining has commented that the original book was neglected. It was saved by the movie. So the narrative goes that this obscure book was published. Nobody paid attention to it. It did not sell well. The reviewers ignored it. And it wasn't until it was picked up in 1925 and made into the Lon Chaney Sr. movie that it became a big deal and anybody even noticed it. Shaw has noted that Haining has written the introduction to the show notes. So if you go to see this musical and you read the show notes, you read what Haining has to say. So everyone who got their information from attending the musical thinks it is true that the book was overlooked and it was a commercial failure in its time. Andrew Lloyd Webber definitely said the book was bad, saved by a chance encounter that we'll talk about next time about how it got to Universal Studios so they could make a picture of it. He felt it was a poorly written penny dreadful. At least he said that later on in the course of the production. And Shaw has taken pains to notice that this is the popular view. There are many who believe that the book tanked. Among them is Dorota Babelis, and she's from the Department of English at the University of Warsaw. I'll just pause as I introduce this first scholar here. We're going to talk about a bunch of scholars of these next three episodes, and just to get a flavor for how prominent a story the Phantom of the Opera is and how big a deal it is, just pay some attention as we're going through it to all the different, the disparity of universities that these scholars come from. It's mostly not North American, and it is global. Like a whole bunch of people you would not think would be drawn to Lacanian psychoanalysis of the Phantom of the Opera, a very much East European psychoanalytic approach to understanding French literature is something you would think would mostly happen in France and North America, but there's an international appeal to this, an international interest in this narrative about the Phantom of the Opera, and you can tell that as you listen to the universities that these people are from. So Dorota Babelis from the Department of English but at the University of Warsaw said it was well received but quickly went out of print. The unattributed author of a biography in the 2002 Modern Library edition of the Phantom of the Opera book said that there were good initial sales, but it was ignored from 1911 until the 1925 movie. So there's a predominant view propagated by Haining, propagated by Andrew Lloyd Webber, that the book was a poorly written commercial failure that is only remembered at all because it was picked up and made into a pretty good movie in 1925. But not so, says Raj Shah, because here's our guy who's not only going to cite his sources, he's going to go back to the original source material himself and read it in the original 100-year-old French. Here's what he says. There were reviews, and they were generally positive, and he has the footnotes you can look up to prove it. In the archives, he found Leroux's own accounting ledgers to show his income and the international rights, and then he also cites a bunch of contemporary newspaper accounts that say the book was selling well, so things that were published in 1910, 1911, 1912 that talk about how the sales of the book were doing quite well. So Shaw believes, and now just kind of as a side note, though, we should note that Raj Shah is truly the hero of citing your sources, getting good information to answer important questions. But it is also true that Raj Shah believes that the Phantom of the Opera is on the cusp of entering the canon of great literature. It will soon be like Frankenstein or Dracula, and not the movie, not the musical, but the book is what Shaw believes is about to enter the canon of great literature. And my comment is that from what I can tell, it is true what Dorota Babelis has to say, and what that unattributed author of the 2002 version of the book says. It did fine initially, but I can't find a second printing of it until the 1925 movie. So my takeaway is that, as I've mentioned before, this is like John Grisham. This is not like Victor Hugo. It definitely, he's got a couple books that are already, putting some wind in his sails as an author. And there's definitely solid evidence that Shaw provides that the book is not a failure, that it does quite well, and it's got some commercial appeal. But it's not like The Man from La Mancha. It is not like Don Quixote, where it is sold and within 2 years it's gone into 5 different printings and it's gone international, and they're doing, there's evidence that there are stage versions of it going on within just a couple of years of the book being written. And has deep international penetration and has become an international bestseller. It's a book. It's a pretty good book. It's got some literary basis, but it is not at the time great literature. And I guess we'll see if Shaw is right that it's about to be treated as part of the great canon. But I do think Raj Shah is sort of in the minority of that question. So in the end, the book was not a failure. It fell into a genre that is called French Gothic. It was by an author who had some other feathers in his cap. It was a guy with a very able mind and a lot of life experience who knew how to write, even if he was not a literary genius. There's something in this story that he produced, however, that has spurned multiple adaptations and not just Andrew Lloyd Wright's musical. We'll talk about those in the next episode when we talk about the different movies that it has spawned, and then we'll talk about other musical productions. So mystery number 1, was the book a total flop? And the answer is no. It was not a total flop. It had some commercial success, but it was not a runaway best-selling hit. It definitely needed the 1925 movie to keep its momentum going. And I guess I'll just say, if Don Quixote was never made into a stage play, was never made into a musical, you would know it because it was a great book and has had tons of attention. I don't know that the same is true of the Phantom of the Opera. It is a book. It was an okay book. It was a pretty good book, but we would probably be remembering Gaston Leroux for The Yellow Room more than we would remembering the Phantom of the Opera, if not for the subsequent productions, both in theater and in film. All right. Mystery number 2. What was the inspiration? If you read what I'm going to call the pop fluff, but the sort of journalistic slick trade magazines that are trying to sell you French smelling soap, there's a lot of different people who have a lot of different theories about what the inspiration was. Maybe it's the Boy Masson story. Maybe it's the couple who were afflicted by the fire. Maybe there were other ghost stories floating around. Maybe it's a composite. Maybe it's a bunch of different characters. Maybe it was inspired by real people who did not suffer tragedy. There's a Christine Nilsson who's frequently named as the prototype upon which the Christine Daae character is based. But according to Shaw, he looked up the 2004 thing. He said it was definitely the story of Boy Masson, and that story itself, his research uncovered, was a fake. Here's his reasoning, and it's quite good. There were 3 sources that had some version of that story of Boy Masson, and Leroux was evidently treating them all as one. In the draft manuscript of Leroux's book that Shaw uncovered in the archives, there's a quote from that Roqueplan's manuscript that almost verbatim takes that section that I had paraphrased at the beginning of this episode. That it's that account that appears simultaneously in the newspaper in 3 different languages, and Leroux takes that exact same passage and originally had dumped it right into his version of his book. There is many possible sources for the inspiration of the Phantom of the Opera narrative, but what Raj Shah has found is that in that manuscript, definitely Leroux was thinking about that particular Boy Masson event. That's the one that he had based it on. It was verbatim in there. That was edited out before the book got printed, but that is concrete evidence that that's what Leroux was thinking about when he wrote the book. And tantalizingly, all the names in that story are real. They appear in the 1786 Almanac for Theater Events, although the dancer Dorval is first name is not Nanine. That's just kind of a misreading of the almanac. Mazur is also a real name. He was also a lieutenant who also commanded guards around the Parisian Opera. So all 3 members of that love triangle are actual people who really existed. But while the people are real, the events are not, because they were all supposed to have died in 1786, and in 1787 they are still appearing as living people in the almanac. The story about the bones being used in a play are inspired by a piece of satire that was published in 1852 by a guy named Hector Berlioz. They gained some credibility, and it's definitely parody, that this Hector Berlioz guy is given the challenge, could write something funny. He writes this apocryphal and self-evidently false story about bones being used in a play. Now, it does gain some credibility because there were theaters that had, and I think some do, still use a real human skull in some productions of Hamlet. And when I say some still do, there are enough productions where when they do Hamlet, they make it a special point to say we didn't use a real human skull in this. So that's, I guess, an issue in the production of Hamlet. But the story about the bones being used is definitely fictitious. So although the names are real, the people did not die, and the use of the bones came from a separate and obviously untrue story. And then part of the smoking gun is the timing, that the events were supposed to have happened in the 1780s, but they don't really appear in print before 1841. And that is just as the opera is about to launch their production of Les Fraichutes as a follow-up to an earlier supernatural hit that had run in the opera. The fact that the story appears using almost identical language in lots of papers just as the production is about to open after 60 years of silence, Raj Shah estimates means it's a publicity stunt. This was something that was designed to take Beyermeer's 1941 production and give it a little advanced PR, create a little audience interest in it. So the stories are definitely inspired by the Boy Masson story. We know that from the unpublished manuscript. It was probably the genesis of the Phantom narrative, but the stories themselves are all untrue. All right, which gets us to mystery number 3. What parts are real? Is the introduction literal or not? Well, as we mentioned before, the phonographs are real and they were placed in 1907. Everyone agrees, but I take Raj Shah's 2013 account to be definitive. There are lakes and catacombs. They are there. They are rarely seen, but the accounts of what they look like differ. There are some skeletons down there. Gillian Russo says the bones story about Boy Masson have been debunked, but cites no source. Shaw, however, takes a couple paragraphs in his 2013 article to make a convincing case that nobody's ever found any, but not just like the absence of evidence is the proof that it wasn't there, that he has identified that people have made concerted efforts to find bones in the catacombs near the lake in the Paris Opera, and nobody ever has. Which leads to the question, is that introduction real? I'm going to read to you the quote from Gillian Russo. Remember, she's our journalist friend, and it says, another rumor that, and this is a quote, another rumor that inspired Leroux is the story of a ghost who haunts the Palais Garnier. Not only did the tale inspire him, but Leroux became obsessed with proving that the ghost was real. And then a paragraph or two later, quote, though the ghost presence is hearsay, or according to some sources, the opera ghost house is actually a jilted old woman, Leroux firmly believed that the ghost is real. And real here probably means not a spirit, but the tone's not a spirit like a real guy in flesh and bone, not a ephemeral entity that you can't touch. But the tone definitely suggests that Russo takes the introduction to be literal. The introduction, remember, says these events really happened and the phantom was real. If you take that to be true, then you might conclude Leroux did believe that they were real and that it wasn't just a novel to Leroux, but he actually believed it and he went looking for evidence, and that description of all the people he met and talked to is accurate. Dorota Babalos, remember the scholar from the University of Warsaw, says maybe it's real. And as a publicity stunt for the 1925 movie, or at least in the advanced publicity from the 1925 movie, Leroux himself claimed that it was real. That's from Shaw's 2013 article. But that same article by Shaw says that the original manuscript makes it clear that it's all made up. Parts of that introduction might have some basis in fact, but in the whole, it is untrue. There are no bones. The Persian, however, is real. Shaw's 2013 manuscript has a word-for-word description of a guy from 1857 who fits the Persian in the book almost exactly. The Persian, of course, did not find a phantom, did not find an assassin, and didn't know anybody that fits the narrative of the story, but was definitely sort of an international, let's say, police officer, sort of a 1857 version of Interpol. He came and went to track people who were different governments were interested in apprehending, but they were crossing borders. He also makes a convincing case that the characters were based on or are composites of actual people. And he is also agrees that Christine Nilsson was the opera singer that many thought had inspired the Christine in the Phantom of the Opera book. Which gets us to our final question, the big mystery. What is it that has made this narrative work? Why is it that this story of everything that could be out there has survived over 100 years, inspired multiple movies, including a couple really good ones, and more than one musical, including the one that is now sort of the musical, one of the biggest musicals of all time, and as we'll talk about later, maybe one of the biggest entertainment and operations of all time? What makes this narrative work? Well, the couple things I want to say at the beginning are that the character here is the Phantom. The Phantom does all the action. It's the Phantom that we care about. Christine and Raoul are just sort of had this, I'm going to say, earlier I called it high school dating drama. And this is sort of like the 1910 version of that. Oh, is Christine a loose woman because she's talking to a stranger in her dressing room? That's drama. We were childhood friends. Are we going to get married? Are we not going to get married? My family disapproves. There's nothing in there, I think, that would be memorable. But the Phantom is. The action centers around him. He's the mystery that everyone else is trying to solve. It is his activities that are driving what's happening in the narrative. Everybody else is reacting to him, and he is just compelling in a way that the other characters are not. The other thing to know, as I mentioned before, what really keeps this thing moving is the movie, which we'll get to later. And we will try to answer the question, is it the narrative of the movie or the musical that really makes it resonate with the public? But the character Eric is described in the book as deformed and disfigured, and that is crucial to the way Christine reacts to him and crucial to his motivations. And part of what the 1925 movie did was, when that face first appears, it is indeed startling. And even, now that we live in the era of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 12, that, you can watch that 1925 version. That's still a surprising thing. And in 1925, there was not a genre of horror film that they could be drawn on to make that a big deal. So the fact that it is startling here in 2024, as we watch it in 1925, it was groundbreaking and terrifying. And so I think it's something about the visuality. It is what the book set up, was a visual image that the film in 1925, just at the onset of the film industry, was able to capture. But it really has worked. Why? Well, I'm going to start with some normal explanations. Anne Perry, who wrote the introduction to the 2002 Modern Library edition of the book Phantom of the Opera, said that the ghost is the best and worst of all of us. And that is why it is such an appealing character. Two other scholars, Suhasini and Parama. I'm not going to use their first names. They have many of them. I'm using their last names only. But they are from the Universitas Pendidikan Ganesha in Bali. They find that the good in villains elevates us all. For example, the Phantom shows you that you can overcome ugliness with your true talents and you can make much of your life. It's more suggested as sort of a mental exercise. It's something we should do, but it is kind of consistent with what Perry has to say, that there is something in the Phantom that appeals to us. You can kind of relate to the idea that I am a talented outsider. Society's not letting me in and I have more than I can contribute here. That's a feeling that enough people have had, that is a theme that resonates to the readers of the book. Raj Shah just thinks it's a really good horror story. He thinks it's up there with Dracula and Frankenstein, in the same way that maybe Don Quixote is just a really funny story. Maybe the Phantom of the Opera is just a really good horror story, and that accounts for its success. So those are some fairly normal explanations, that there's something about the Phantom that we can relate to. We are drawn to the positive qualities, and maybe the Phantom represents but also the worst of us, and then that's enough to make this story endure. There are also psychoanalytic interpretations. I will give you the flavor of three. The first one is going to be the most extensive. Now, for those of you who have not worked their way through psychoanalytic analysis of a literary text, my goodness, it's a lot. They tend to use very elaborate phrasing, very long sentences, twisty things, abstract concepts, and long words. I'm going to give you three of them real quick here to get a flavor of it. Then I'll try to give you my interpretation of what it means and how it can all be processed. Chung-Nam Lee in 2014 is from the Hanyang University in Seoul, South Korea, gave a Benjaminian psychoanalysis. Benjamin was a big psychoanalytic theorist. He's one of the big names that if you were into psychoanalysis and into critical theory, everyone would know. And it goes like this. In psychology, we know that humans have a consciousness and an unconscious. We have a conscious mind and an unconscious mind. And of course, Sigmund Freud was like, let's tap into the unconscious. That can explain a lot of our behavior and a lot of our problems and anxieties and desires. But just as individuals have a consciousness and an unconscious, there is a collective unconscious in a society, and that gets expressed through many things in many ways, including architecture and song and literature. In Lee's estimation, the opera house is kitsch. That is something cheap and mass-produced that expresses something about our unconscious desires and appeals to that. But it represents and expresses a cultural transition taking place, moving into modernity, so that we went from the sort of the divine rule of kings and the palaces, and we're moving from that into modernity, where there's an industrial revolution, there's mass production, and that's causing anxiety. The cultural transition is taking place, and the opera house is sort of in the middle of that. And he says Lee, it is the moment at which we are moving into modernity, and the opera house represents that. Eric is a foreigner, so he taps into the anxieties that are reshaping Paris. Eric must be anonymous to connect with others. That feeling of anonymity you get in, like when you're riding the subway and in mass modern events. You can relate to Eric, but he's also not foreigner and he's an outsider, and that was an anxiety that was going on in Paris right at the time that the novel came out. The upper and the lower floors represent the Parisian underworld, which was rampant at the time. And so Lee sees that as you read the narrative, that Leroux must be making an allegory between when you go lower and lower into the cellar, you get closer and closer to the Parisian underworld, and that it's a commentary on that, or an expression of the unconscious anxiety that the author and the society had about crime at the time, and immigration and foreigners coming in. Here is a direct quote. Make of this what you will. Quote, "The functional machinery and anonymous structure of the building, like a labyrinth resembling a modern metropolis, do not allow the art to find its authentic residence. Ironically, the transcendental homelessness of the modern is revealed in the home of the art, whose splendid phantasmagory shrouds the decaying process of the bourgeois middle class and its high culture." If you don't know exactly what that means, but you think you kind of do, then you and I are in the exact same place. Transcendental homelessness, the modern. I will just say, notice how he uses phrase like the modern as if that is a single thing, or that definite article that precedes it is very common in this, and it's part of what I take issue with. And the home of the art, the bourgeois, the decaying process of the bourgeois middle class and the high culture. I mean, maybe that's what it is. That's definitely what Lee thinks. So I'm not going to do the work to put that in plain English, but I do think, you can relate to the Phantom because he's a figure that embodies cultural tension, and the opera house itself it expresses something about culture. So those things, I think, are part of that. Anyway, that is Lee's take, the Benjaminian analysis of what the Phantom of the Opera is. It resonates, I guess, or represents or expresses the unconscious anxieties that society is experiencing about crime and immigration and the transition from an older world into modernity. All right. Here is psychoanalysis number 2. This is from Rati Raharto and Rihanna Pramadasari. They are from the College of Languages and Communication Studies at the Sultan Agong Islamic University in Indonesia. This is not a Benjaminian psychoanalysis. This is a Jungian analysis of a rewrite as a children's book by Diane Nam. So Diane Nam took the Phantom of the Opera. She rewrote it as a children's book. And here I'm going to mention there are a bunch of children's versions of the Phantom of the Opera. There's the Phantom Cat of the Opera by David Wood, a children's book where they're all cats. There is a Nancy Drew version. There is a Muppets version of the Phantom of the Opera. And it should surprise no one to know there's also a Scooby-Doo version, but many, many children's books. And anyway, Raharto and Pramadasari, they are taking that on, and they're going to do a Jungian analysis of the children's book. The basic thesis is that the Phantom is an anti-hero that readers have sympathy for. Here's the quote. "Anti-hero is gaining sympathy because he is surrounded by unfortunate fates. He wants to be loved because since he was born, nobody has ever wanted to look at him. It is not his fault to be born with flaws on his face, but the society is being cruel by not accepting him." These are obviously not words written by a native English speaker, but, bonus points to people at an Islamic university taking on Jung, writing in a second language and trying to interpret the Phantom of the Opera. The point is refreshingly straightforward, but it is clear that the Phantom does some terrible things, but his motivation is that he deeply loves Christine and society has rejected him. That is what we learned from the Jungian analysis. In the words of Prostechnik Vogon Jeltz, quote, "Deep down, he just wants to be loved." And bonus points to all the listeners out there who get the Douglas Adams reference. All right. Number 3, psychoanalysis interpretation number 3. This is from Gerald Hogel. This is a commentary piece that appears at the end of the 2002 Modern Library edition of the book. He starts with a Zizek quote. Slavoj Zizek is definitely another one of those names that anybody into high critical theory would know. And he's sort of I think of them as the high priest of critical theory. You really have to get into what they're saying to even understand what they're talking about. And then you have so much psychologically invested in just trying to figure out their book in the first place. You tend to believe that there was something there just so, it wasn't a waste of time. Either that is completely right, and there are these thoughts in there that are so deep that they can only be expressed in this very dense prose, or it's possible to say what they want in a more simple way, and maybe that all those dense words are hiding a lack of true content or some shaky assumptions there. Anyway, Gerald Hogel starts with a quote from Zizek. He references a Freudian work, and here's the quote. The original Phantom, I would argue, written by a journalistic novelist manifestly steeped in the Anglo-European and American Gothic parentheses, among other discourses and parentheses, shows the enormous range of cultural abjections that Gothic constructions make possible at a time of great social upheaval and consequent attempts at reestablishing national class, racial, gender, and city/county distinctions. Moreover, by taking these tendencies in the Gothic to such extremes, the original Phantom comes to expose the basic nature of the culturally determined deadlock of desire, the social and then psychological instability that perpetually threatens the dissolution of the middle class fragmented subject. It is this betwixt and between condition, both half revealed and half concealed in Leroux's Phantom, that leads to the Gothic process and other processes of cultural othering, to its concealment within the ideologies of personal unconsciousness and the nuclear family romance, and thus within purely psychological notions of abjection, and to the effort in nearly all the adaptations to keep us safe from the Phantom's greatest threats. There's a lot there. My loose interpretation of that is we feel guilt and unease about foreign others, and the Phantom, I'm putting others in air quotes there that you can't see on a radio, of course, but there are people who are outside our immediate social group. We think of them as others. That's especially true in Paris at the time because there are people immigrating and society is moving into modernity, and the Phantom creates unconscious distress. The Phantom is a foreigner. He longs to be in the privileged high society and have their acceptance, the aristocracy to accept him, but he can't have it, and he expresses his love by withdrawing. This becomes scary because there's a deformed foreigner who can bring the world of high opera down, but in the end, it's his love for us that makes him sacrifice so that those who are privileged can thrive. There's tension there, maybe guilt. Okay, so those are three different attempts by psychoanalysts to interpret the text, say what it means and why it's there. Here's my take on psychoanalysis. I don't want to be too dismissive, but it is true that literature and architecture expresses something about the author and the culture in which they're creative, and also about the audience. It might include something about collective anxiety. The ideas that are there are important to think about, and it's important to think about what they represent, and of course to put text in context. But it's also clear that there's a lot of different interpretations once you take that leap to, okay, but I'm now going to see how unconscious desires are expressed in this text. Not everybody comes up with the same answer. There's a lot of different answers, maybe some common themes, but it's a far cry from there is a psychoanalytic meaning to a text. There's many different things, and there are bitter fights about what exactly that means. It's not entirely clear to me how direct the line can be drawn between either one, between a collective unconsciousness and the different interpretations and anxiety. In my view, these theories tend to be a little deterministic. What is the modern? What is the art? What is the bourgeoisie? Those to me are much more fluid concepts that suddenly get locked into fixed categories as you're reading this. Or as Sigmund Freud might have said, sometimes an opera house is just an opera house. But also they don't really grapple with the reception of the book at the time. The authors typically don't think they need to. I don't have to show that the book was popular or that it resonated with an audience. I just have to show the possibilities and the meanings that are inherent in the text. But can it be true that audiences are drawn to the Phantom or the building because they resonate with the deep unconscious desire and anxiety? If the audiences weren't actually drawn to the book, what if Andrew Lloyd Webber is right and nobody was reading the book? Then why is it important that the Phantom of the Opera is occurring at a time of cultural transition? And, you know, if there is a collective unconscious and that was driving what is going on in the narrative, as you can tell psychoanalytic theorists by reading the text to determine the meaning, then why is it nobody was reading the book or the book wasn't actually that big a deal at the time? It's not so much that I think the book was or wasn't a big deal. It's just, it seems to me that the psychoanalytic theory is race right past that question, and it really needs to be something that they are drawn to. So anyway, there are straightforward interpretations of why this text matters, that the Phantom represents the best and the worst of us. We can relate to the Phantom as the key character, and the psychoanalysts would say, and part of the reason we can relate to it is because of our participation in the collective unconsciousness. Here, I guess, is finally my take. As I mentioned before, it's really the Phantom who makes this book. All the action is around the Phantom, and none of the other characters really stand out. The Phantom is an outcast who's hideous but talented, who thrives but is never accepted. He becomes an accomplished musician. He becomes an assassin, we are told. He works as a magician. He can make all these illusions appear. He can put terror in an entire city, but he's never really accepted. So he's somebody who's made himself into something sensational, but it is something that society can't accept. And maybe that's relatable. Maybe we all feel outcast. If you have ever read your own teen poetry 20 years later, or you look at populist politics where some of the most privileged people actually think that they're the ones in the gun sights of society, everyone feels a little outcast by society, and everybody feels that they have some tremendous talent or something that they could do to truly be more than they are if if society was more accepting of them. But in the case of the Phantom, that is supercharged on both fronts. He is really outcast. He has to live in the catacombs in a crypt beneath this opera house. And he really is in possession of some truly remarkable skills, pyrotechnic specialist and musician. But in the end, it's not really a morality tale about acceptance of the socially downcast. There is that quote from the end of the book that talks about that, but that story's been told a bunch of different times. What is obvious about the book is that it is a stalker story, maybe the stalker story. That Suhasini and Pratama book or article that I had been talking about, they make the point that Christine kind of likes the devotion. The Phantom, who drives the narrative, who is the character that is compelling, that makes people come back to this, is a stalker. And I don't know of too many other stories where that is a big deal. Later, this would of course become very much a horror trope, but I don't think that at the time or before the publication of the original book that stalker character was a trope, a recurring theme that you would see in horror stories. And even if it's not the first, it's definitely one of the more prominent stalker stories. Suhasini and Pratama talk about it's kind of flattering. Christine kind of likes the devotion. Here is somebody totally devoted to you. That must mean there's something good about you. It's also a stalker stories about an attraction that goes wrong and becomes obsessive and toxic. It's a horror type that reaches its apex here. Dracula wants to suck your blood. Frankenstein wants revenge on his maker and all the townfolk that have rejected him. The Wolfman is cursed, but the Phantom wants to possess you out of love, even when he knows that you can't return it to him. And that is something different from those other horror villains. That's something that stands apart. And I think, I'm not saying all stalker stories will stand out and endure over time, but maybe a really good stalker story does stand out and appeal over time. And although we are only looking at anti-heroes when you're talking about horror, the antagonist / protagonist / anti-hero, they're never well-balanced heroic people. They always have something about them that is driving their horror producing behavior. But it is true that the Phantom of the Opera does seem to have fundamentally different motivations than the other great horror villains out there. And finally, I'll just say it's a tragedy. It's unrequited love that ends in disaster. Only really for the Phantom. You know, the two faces you got on the top of the theater are the smiling face of comedy and the anguished face of drama and tragedy, and a Greek, some of the earliest theater examples we have are the Greek tragedies. Tragedy is something that appeals. And I guess a tragedy story that is rearticulated for a time and place in a very powerful way with a compelling character is something that can catch on to the human psyche and take hold. Okay, but, having said all of that, there is a character in this book. That character is compelling. It is definitely a tragedy, is definitely the apex of the stalker narrative, certainly at the time that it was published. It is also true that what really makes this narrative keep going over time are the remakes of it. We'll get to those later. And that will do it for this episode. There's a really spooky book set in the perfect location of the Paris Opera House. It is a great example of the Gothic vibe, and it is inspired by untrue events that were actual stories at the time. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the 1925 movie starring Lon Chaney Sr. How did the book get from Leroy to Carl Laemmle, the CEO of Universal Studios? If you think you've heard the story, I promise there's much more to it than you've heard already. What plot changes were made, and did they help or hurt the story? And after Starting late, running long, going over budget, the film was going so poorly that the original release was canceled following 2 disastrous preview showings, even though they'd been promoting it nonstop for 2 months. The show was still a smash hit of the silent film era. What saved the show and why does it work? Follow me through the catacombs of the Paris Opera House to find out in our next episode of Theater History and Mysteries.